Hello and welcome to Exchanges for another week. Social impact, infrastructure spending, government spending, long-term futuristic thought process. All of these are chicken and egg scenarios that we're all going through. So why not get somebody who sees this, has done this for the last 20 years, has been head of the property council, has worked through government enterprise, the whole 9 yards, and is a social futurist in her thinking, in Danni Hunter. Danni Hunter runs the Hunter Collective. She is that conduit between how governments think, the social impact, and the community requirements that we need. And that's why I'm so excited to have her on. So before we get to Danni, please remember we are sponsored here now by More, a lifestyle by design app designed to help everyday Australians reach their financial goals through property and investment. That's more, moorr.com.au. But now the social impact that is spending through government with Danni Hunter. Danni Hunter, welcome to Exchanges. You describe yourself as a social futurist and somebody that, is the conduit between government, private enterprise, and society. Can you take me through exactly how you've come to, the angle that you now are, the options that you're bringing to clients? Because I think what you've got is a beautiful link about where the future of not just society, but where we as a state, nation, and as a globe is heading.
Thank you, Evan, for having me on this podcast. It's great. And it's so great to see how expansive the Exchanges podcast has become. You've had some
Thank
really
you.
great guests, and I feel really, really privileged to be on today. So I guess, look, my focus has come out of over 15 years working between the private sector and government with a really strong interest in how the two come together, but also how they impact the community, the health of communities, the ability of communities to access vital services, and the way that our cities evolve with the input of government infrastructure. So, like you said, I guess I am a bit of a social futurist and looking at issues like housing, infrastructure, tax, renewable energy, the shift the shifted energy, and just different things that impact everyday Australians every day. That's the stuff that I get excited about.
Yeah, so do I. Wow. Okay, so that's a huge thing. There's two things in there I immediately want to pick you up. You have been very prominent, particularly in Victoria, where you and I both live. You talk there about the link between infrastructure and society. It has been a big talking point over the last, particularly 5 years since COVID,
Yeah.
around the social link of infrastructure and society. Take me through what's been, in your view, good and bad about the infrastructure spending, particularly in things like the CBD, but also this link between big infrastructure builds, build it, they will come, but the missing link that is happening in the society side, because clearly the link hasn't been made, particularly for Victoria. It's sort of, you can make some arguments western parts of Sydney. You can also make the same argument to some parts of Brisbane.
Yeah.
Take me through that sort of belief that government's building this infrastructure, it will help society, but actually what we're seeing is it's not necessarily there yet, or will never be there in the long term.
Well, there's kind of three main phases. There's the lead up and the argument for infrastructure. And in the case of Victoria and New South Wales as well, it's been a catch up. It's been a
Hmm.
catch up with the population growth that we've had, but the lack of infrastructure we've delivered over many, many years in successive governments. And then there's the piece around community engagement while it's being constructed, and private sector engagement while it's being constructed as well. And you mentioned the CBD. There's obviously an uplift in property values, particularly in Sydney, where the Sydney Metro has been delivered. And there's a desire from government to see development around those areas, and we call that transit-oriented development of new office buildings, homes, community services that are really well located around that transport infrastructure. And then it's the kind of ending phase of when it's been delivered and how it impacts community, and how that piece of transport infrastructure actually really embeds itself in community. And good design and really proactive placemaking is incredibly important, not just
Hmm.
in our cities, but sort of more in our suburbs. Because if you don't take a placemaking approach, then it just becomes a train station in the middle of nowhere, or a bus stop that doesn't actually service the community it's in. And so this is why it's so important that there's partnership between government, private sector, and community, and that it's really respectful and positive. And we see various dynamics across projects like this, particularly when they're large and big in scale. And the suburban rail loop here in Victoria is incredibly contentious, both
Hmm.
from a community perspective, but also from a private sector perspective. And the government's now calling it a housing project. So not only is it about delivering a loop around the city that will get people from A to B without coming into the CBD, but it's actually about delivering housing supply around those areas that at the end of the day, in the 30 to 50-year time horizon that project has, there'll be a huge amount of housing supply around those areas.
That to me though sounds like a chicken and egg conundrum, right?
Right.
So is it, and because this is the other thing I think that's also lost in the term infrastructure, like what is infrastructure? It's very easy to argue, rail and those kind of things, that's infrastructure.
Yeah.
But what you've also highlighted there is it's hospitals, it's
Yeah.
schools, it's what have you. So the chicken and egg question I have for you, let's take not the suburban rail loop, but the underground that they've just built
Yep.
from Sunbury, on the Sunbury line in Victoria.
Melbourne, yeah.
They've, you talked about stations in nowhere. So you've got, at the moment, a scenario where they've built the rail under the city
Mm.
and under places like North Melbourne all the way out to St Kilda. However, there's a couple of those that are sort of vacant, with the prospect, as you said, of the next 30 to 50 years of there being the housing projects. How do you get that right? How do you bring the society along, the social side of it, to understand that the infrastructure spending that is happening at the moment on the rail side will bring the infrastructure of hospitals, care, and therefore housing along into the future?
Well, this is why taking a placemaking approach is so important. So it's not just about the station; it's about co-locating services. In the northern parts of Melbourne, for example, there's a huge medical hub that needs expanding, but that medical hub's been somewhat curtailed by the fact that trains will create some difficulties for X-ray machinery, for example. So it gets
Yep.
very complex. But I think what you're alluding to there with the chicken and egg scenario is really interesting, because essentially the Melbourne Metro loop and building it was because the city loop is at capacity and can't grow anymore. And the reason that we have the Northeast Link around Melbourne is because congestion got so bad and we can't grow anymore. So there's two intents when it comes to infrastructure. It's about solving problems that we should have solved years ago, and then there's projects like the suburban rail loop that cop a lot of flack right now, and for various different reasons we can talk about. But that's a future-looking project that will deliver future-looking places, as opposed to trying to catch up with problems that we should have solved years ago.
The other thing that's in that chicken and egg question, and you've sort of talked about the private side, is at the moment, state, the way I frame it is, the feds collect it, the states spend it in terms of
Mm,
the budget, but it brings in private entity and private equity and private capital. And we forget superannuation is part of that. I mean, it is a capital sucking machine because we put 12% of our, income per month into it. It is always growing. Why though, however, is government so sort of at arm's length or almost slightly sort of negative to the idea of allowing that private investment in? Because again, we now have what is referred to as off balance sheet funding for infrastructure spending because it's
yeah,
an investment.
yeah.
How do we break that? Because again, looking at, using the suburban rail loop as an example, or looking at the particularly the tunnels and the road infrastructure in Sydney with the private side, where does the social part of that line up? Because again, there's this element also in socials that it should be done by government, it should be inverted commas free,
Mm.
whereas private entity turns around and says, "Well, we need a return for our investment."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, toll roads are a perfect example, but, you look at the numbers. Australia's annual transport infrastructure spend is expected to reach 51 billion by this year, and that's up from $30 billion a decade ago. So government simply can't, on the current tax base that we have, deliver this all and keep it for free, and that's difficult. The cost of living and the cost of delivery pressures are very much impacting government budgets, and they're blowing projects out. Construction costs have increased by about 40% since before the pandemic for a number of different reasons. and government projects are very susceptible to that. But these government projects are game changers, and where there is private appetite, like for toll roads, for example, because there's a clear revenue raising stream there, there is some super fund interest and institutional interest. But super funds invest in much more infrastructure and development projects overseas than they do here, and they've been doing that
Why?
for a really long time. Well, there's better returns overseas.
Okay.
The way that super works is that it needs to deliver a regulated return for its members, and that's really important. Where we're seeing super start to play, and look, there's infrastructure assets like the Melbourne Airport where super has been present for a long time and they get a really strong return for their members on that. There is some move from development into infrastructure from groups like Dexus and AMP, well, who took in AMP, that were traditionally property funds but are now moving into infrastructure funds as well. So there is some level of new appetite, but I mean, Dexus isn't a super fund, so
Yeah.
its drivers are different.
But
When it
they're the
comes to
clients you're talking about, right? So there is interest. There is that sort of, I mean, again, we are talking about when we are actually doing this interview, we're doing it a day after a massive private health
yeah,
hospital company has just gone into receivership.
yeah.
There is interest there. Again, as you said, it's about the business itself and the income to return that comes from
Well,
that, right?
exactly, the returns just have to be there, and, this is a message we get across business at the moment, that it's pretty hard to do business in Australia. Australia's economic population growth fundamentals are so strong. Our economy is without a doubt gonna grow over the coming years, and attracting investment into Australia and getting, domestic investors to invest in new projects is gonna be really critical to that. Because, like I said, government simply can't do it alone. And when you think about housing, you can't solve the housing crisis without infrastructure. The
Mhm.
suburbs we're building on our city's edges require massive amounts of infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, community services, bridges, biodiversity. And all of that needs to be done. And a lot of that does get pushed onto the private sector, which then has an impact on house prices. But as a whole, Australia's cities are growing exponentially. We're behind other countries like the UK and the US, but our cities are growing, and that is that underlying population growth, relatively stable government, certain economy. We are looking much more like a very attractive place for investment globally, and that will have a positive impact on things like the ability and the speed to deliver infrastructure and new housing projects.
We're gonna come back to the housing thing because there's a
Yeah.
question immediately that comes out of that. But just very quickly then, what is it that needs to make investment more attractive in Australia? Is it lowering, regulation? Is it increasing return? What do you think that missing link is that will then lead to that social impact that you talk about into
Mm.
the future?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of it's about sentiment as well as return. When
Mhm.
companies look at Australia, they see foreign investment surcharges, and that says to them, "Do we really want investment here?" Particularly in the property sector, there are pretty significant foreign investment surcharges in Victoria. They also exist in New South Wales and Queensland, but to a lesser extent. Those, I guess, regulatory hurdles that businesses have to get over to make that investment stack can be really quite tweaked by government if they really wanted to attract that investment in. And I think that's something that they'll think about over the long term. But it's again, Australia is looking like a very, very safe haven for capital at the moment in the context of all the global uncertainty. And property is looking like a pretty stable asset as well.
Because yeah, I mean, you've alluded to Donald Trump there in terms of obviously the change that's come about with
Yeah.
regards to, the US is ahead at the moment, but clearly
Yeah.
tariffs are, basically a foreign investment tax.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that, the way tariffs work, it's actually paid by the consumer, not by the sovereign.
Yeah.
I want to therefore also, you talked before about housing and the social link and the community part of that. How do we then deal with the NIMBY and sort of mind frame? Because again, as you said, the moment our big mega cities, Melbourne, Sydney, to some extent Brisbane as well, if you want to include the fact that, Sunshine and Gold Coast links up, Perth now is becoming that as well. How do we then, because we can't grow, right? We can't grow in the suburbs because of, not in my backyard. Now you've also got the new one, which is YIMBY, which is yes in my backyard. What does needs to happen to change that social thinking? How are we going to deal with the fact that if we are going to see downsizing from baby boomers, for example,
Mm,
the community lifestyle and overall lifestyle satisfaction that they get in the areas they currently live in
yeah.
is what they don't want to leave. How are we going to break NIMBY? What is going to attract, not just the investment, but also the group of people that need to start moving away from the lifestyle they had maybe through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s?
And that change is really scary for a lot of
Mm,
people, and often they're really well-meaning people, saying, "No, not in my backyard." And it's interesting because the tension between local councils and state governments who are now only just recently trying to drive change through more assertive development, precinct plans and approaches to approvals. Local councils are very, very sensitive to local views and local sentiment, and so there's a tension there between those levels of government, as to who kind of wins out. And with most planning approvals, councils get a say first before it goes to the state government. And I guess from my perspective, though, it's much more about social equity than it is
yeah.
about how our neighbourhoods are changing. If government does it right, the change to our neighbourhoods should be really positive. They should give us greater access to community services, locations like parks and really nice open spaces, and development should be integrated with the surrounding uses that it has. And sometimes that's not the case, and sometimes there's a very genuine reason, like the community says, "No, we don't like that. It's too tall, it's too big, whatever," and that should be listened to. But at the end of the day, if key workers, particularly, this is something I've looked at really closely, is the ability for key workers to work close to live close to where they work. And you think about, this is actually a great example of a super fund investment. Aware Real Estate, through Aware Super, invested in a key worker development right near the Alfred Hospital on St Kilda Road, and it's primarily and exclusively available to nurses and doctors that work at the Alfred. And that rent is put at an affordable level, so a percentage below market rent to make it accessible. Because otherwise, nurses and doctors and other hospital staff who work at the Alfred can't afford to live in Paran and Richmond and St
Hmm.
Kilda, because they're higher value property areas and they're not accessible on those key worker wages. So when I talk about social equity, it's actually in all of our advantage that we have people who need and want to live in the suburbs close to where they work, which are well serviced by infrastructure and transport, that they do have accessibility to affordable housing. And affordable housing can take many forms. It's not necessarily discount to market housing, but it's also different typologies of housing, townhouses and apartments instead of, massive houses on a quarter acre block. So that diversity is really important. And if we get it right, they are absolutely amazing things for the community when that change happens. But change can be really scary.
Yeah, it can. And again, the data that I'm starting to see, New South Wales is the one facing the biggest headache for what you've just described around key worker. They actually have second or the lowest payments for particularly key industries like nursing and that kind of space, but
Yeah.
obviously the most expensive housing market in the country, and they're losing them hand over fist. Do want to go back though to another thing you touched on there around, market value of housing and the
Mm.
NIMBY issue is, I've asked this before from several guests, and I'd love to get your view on it as well. Is that, when did the home become a house that became an asset with a value? Because is this also part of the problem now? Is that Australia and Australians now see the white picket fence as more than just a home. It is now the biggest asset inside their overall wealth,
Mm.
and therefore possible impacts to that wealth is a massive, not just the scary, using your word, but also a value proposition that all of a sudden you're changing the value of their wealth. Where do we sit with this? Like, because this is the tough part, I think, is
Yeah.
we now have our nest egg is the bricks and mortar that we live
Yeah.
in every day.
And it's really look, it's not unique to Australia, but it's really embedded in our culture. It's that Aussie
Yeah.
dream. It's how most families build wealth and security. But in terms of price point, Sydney's median house price is set to hit sort of $1.7 million in coming months, and Brisbane, Adelaide are close to a million. So the average mortgage is getting higher and higher and higher, and it's jumped 73% since the last decade. We're addicted to debt. We're
Yes, we
absolutely
are.
addicted to debt. And it's driving somewhat of inequality. You've got people that are on the housing, that are in the housing market or own their own house with a mortgage, most likely, because more than a third of households are paying off mortgages. And then you've got this emphasis around people getting on the housing ladder. And that's where that housing crisis piece really comes in. We're talking about first home buyers and people that are moving through their family or milestone parts of their lives, and they need different kinds of housing. So, if you own property in Australia, you've done well. If you don't, the ladder's getting further out of reach. And this is the response that we have to have, and that we've seen play out in politics, particularly in the federal election, and starting to see it very, very clearly in state election cycles as well. So the electorate and the community really care about it. But if you own a home, you don't want it to be more affordable, because that means it goes down in value.
Yep.
And if you if you don't own a home, you want it all to be more affordable, because then you can have greater accessibility. But the demand and supply elements in Australia are really out of whack. We just haven't been producing enough housing to meet the population growth that we've had and that we will have. And that's, I think, the right focus for governments at the moment, is to unlock those approvals, get supply through the approval pipeline. The key missing piece, though, is the investment of scale. The investment of scale in Australian housing is still tentative, and it's still kind of holding back while our economy recovers a little bit more. Interest rates need to go down. Inflation stabilised, but only recently. State government taxes and regulatory frameworks are still pretty difficult. So that other side, that capital side, commercial side of investing in new housing, still has a bit of a way to go.
So that there is my next sort of bugbear from the economic futurist of me and your social futurist of you is,
Mm.
again, what you've basically described there that I love to talk about as well is the counterparty issue is always there, right? So
Oh,
in the end, m- people's contra views consistently smack into each other when it comes to housing.
yeah.
So looking at the state particularly, I mean, in Victoria now, they are forecasting that 47% of all their revenue will come from some form of property taxation, whether that's stamp duty or other. The catch, therefore, is supply and ramping that up, and away you go. But again, transactional taxation in property is such a barrier in behavioral economics, and I know it's in social. When do states start to realize they need to wean themselves off from the transaction tax that is stamp duty? So again, what I was going to ask you with what you said before is, with the increase that we're trying to unlock in supply, do we also then need regulation around who can buy it and where it can be bought? Is it then also giving, first owners those tax breaks that we are hearing about with stamp duty? Because what I think from the social question they've been asked there is, they all sound good in theory, but again, the counterparty issue is there. I mean, it's the same with a bank, right? Your
Mm.
bank is actually making money off you, and therefore, you borrowing from them, as you said, our addiction to debt is in their interests. How do we get around the social issue that is this? How do we actually find ways to improve housing supply for the people that need it
Mm.
without having the counterparty risk getting in the way?
Well, and all of the responses you've cited fuels demand, and demand's not the
Yeah,
problem. We've
yeah,
got we've got endless demand. We don't have endless capacity in terms of borrowing capacity for consumers. That will come with lowering interest rates. But we do have endless demand in terms of people and families and others who want to buy housing in Australia. So the problem remains supply. And we've got to get supply up in not only in our cities, but in our regions. And it's got to be a diverse range of housing typologies. And by that, I mean, house and land, townhouses, apartments, student housing, co-living, other types, build to rent. I live in a build to rent apartment, and it's bloody fantastic. I love it. But for us, it's a sort of a transitional thing between selling or our home and then working out the next place we're going to live when our kids go to high school. So
Hmm.
there are reasons why people need a particular housing typology at a particular time. And you're right, government tax stops people from being able to make those transitions as and when they need to. Downsizers have a real struggle with moving out of the family home into more appropriate housing because they have a stamp duty bill to pay.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, we can see it complete like our state governments are so reliant on stamp duty and land tax. They simply will never, in my opinion, give them up unless there is serious intervention by the federal government that involves underpinning budgets. And that's no small thing. I mean, it sounds great in theory. Let's move everything to a land tax system. But our governments don't have any money right now. They don't have the financial capacity to take such a big hit on their revenue. And maybe they will in the future. I sure hope they do. But right now, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing land tax rates increase, which has a very, very tangible impact on the availability of rental stock. Because if mum and dad investors or self-managed super funds who invest in property that creates rental stock leave the market, then yes, that house might go back into the private ownership pool, which is a good thing. But rents are particularly squeezed right now, and the availability of rental stock is really, really low. And we're seeing investors move out of renting because it's become too hard and too expensive. So
Yep.
there's these unintended consequences of changes around tax and regulation that I don't think necessarily get thought through at the time of decision making. And because government is so reliant on revenue and they see property tax as predominantly one of the only levers that they have to raise revenue, it's an easy target. And it
Yep.
does have broader consequences than government. And I think the community understands.
I think you're dead right. So what I get to talk about first and foremost is for every government action, there's an equal but opposite taxpayer reaction. That is, behavioral economics almost 101. The other part of what you were talking about there is that, before you said about the scariness of the housing market and what have you, governments are absolutely petrified of
Mm.
changing the tax mix. They're petrified of, raising new taxation and what have you. And state governments particularly have this problem where, what other tax levers can they pull? And properties, you said, it's an easy cash cow. It's very simple. It's very easy to sell it to the social community side because we're touching up landlords or whatever it happens to be, despite the fact that landlords now are spread across the age demographic.
Yeah.
Again, the other flip now, and I'm going to slightly change away from properties. Part of the whole thing that we haven't really addressed, the other part of that infrastructure story and about the social side is energy. So
Yeah.
we've just seen the Australian energy regulator rapidly increase the cost of electricity because we are going through an energy transition. There is clearly ideology based into it as well.
Mhm.
We have seen different states do different things. We
Yeah.
have different ideologies across it. The costings keep getting blown out.
Mm.
So I want to get your take about, first and foremost, poles and wires versus, renewal of current energy production sites,
Mm.
but also it's not even an elephant anymore. It's the gorilla that is in Australia. The fact that 55% of household electricity is now generated by solar off the own roof.
Yeah.
Energy is the other part of this discussion. Where and what do we need to do to get energy not just out of the ideology, but onto a level that we can actually start communicating about what 2050 will be like with net zero slash, affordable energy for everyone.
And this is where the community gets engaged, is where its hip pocket is impacted.
Yeah.
And, I've seen a lot of media in recent days around those energy cost increases across some of our states. I think there's 3 that are regulated at a national level, and then the others are regulated at a state level. And those energy increases don't impact everyone, but they certainly set a bar for the market. And in my view, and I believe this very strongly, it's a transition, it's a journey. So there is a role for things like coal and gas as we make those transitions. But at the end of the day, we need clear policy and we need clear milestones and deadlines to be able to attract the investment into that sector that we need to be able to move more meaningfully to renewables. Because if governments flip flop and they're not clear, then investment doesn't know where it's going to go and what it's going to do. So I think one of the things government is doing really well, and like it or loathe it here in Victoria, the government has been very committed to its energy transition to renewables. It's been very clear in its policy and in its messaging. So capital knows how to make a decision. Do they like it? Do they not? And we're seeing we're seeing that. We're seeing greater investment because of that. Interestingly, in Victoria, there's the state-owned electricity commission or company, the SEC, that was
SEC.
one of the SEC, that was one of the government's biggest platforms that it went to the electorate with. And looking at that and comparing that with the failure of the federal Liberal Party's ability to sell the idea of nuclear power is really interesting to me, because the Australian community or the Victorian community sort of really understood what the Labor government wanted to do in terms of making that electricity source public again to reduce costs. But they didn't really get the long-term and cost impacts and opportunity potentially of nuclear power at a
Yep.
national level. So it's a little bit about a sell, as you say, and then it's a little bit about, well, it's a lot about, how is this impacting my hip pocket? And what's it gonna mean for change? It's all conceptual until I have to pay a bill.
Yeah. And so I think that's the fascinating thing, is that we are about to see at December the energy rebates from the federal government come
Yeah.
out. That's been baked into it. Judging by the energy retailers' increases, you could see as much of a 32% increase in energy costs come Christmas, and that's going to affect inflation. You talked about interest rates before, around what the RBA is doing and how that sits into it.
Mm.
I agree with you also, and again, I'm not here to promote nuclear energy or anything like that either, but the missell about it is that at the moment, energy on the nuclear side has been sold as one source, which is uranium. And that's not necessarily the fact going forward. There are things like thorium, for example, which is now becoming a very interesting sort of scenario, that it's going to be a fraction of the uranium price. It is much more abundant. It doesn't have proliferation issues, and it doesn't have the radiation issues that come with uranium. But it's not allowed to be debated. And again, the poles and wires, I mean, you can't fight physics, right? So it costs roughly $1 million per kilometer to push energy down the poles and wires to get it to the areas that we have. The other unknown factor that both sides of politics still can't argue properly is batteries and battery storage. Again, you're starting to hear and see it in Europe about hubbing communities
Yeah.
of solar power and actually putting it into a battery source in the center of that community that then can be put into the power grid as well. Is that also part of the social sale?
Well, I think again, it depends on people's understanding of all of the complexities of our energy systems. It's
And
not
it is
just
very complex, right?
it is, and it's becoming more complex with all of the different sources that you've just spoken about. I mean, you look at the UK; they moved very quickly and much earlier than us towards renewable targets, and their energy costs did increase over that period. There was a direct correlation. So, in my view, there isn't a doubt that energy costs in the short to medium term are likely to increase, because it's more expensive, like you've said, to be able to establish that infrastructure. We're establishing infrastructure from nothing.
Yeah.
And so there's a cost to that. And yes, government can invest, and yes, there's private sector investment, which is really important. But at the end of the day, those feasibilities for those projects have to stack up for there to be a return. And it seems to me that there is a direct correlation between moving to more renewables and the cost of electricity. But over time, that should come down. That should at least stabilize, because we're going to be more apt at using that infrastructure and investing in that infrastructure.
Yeah, we've got a digital future, right? So what you're also
Yeah.
alluding to is that you and I are doing right now is part of the digital future, and the demand for energy is only going one way. So it's about securing that energy future. And then you've also just alluded to the other thing, it's just an accounting thing, right? So we're amortizing it now
Yeah.
rather than sort of doing it from a longer term perspective. We could debate that for days. I realize we're running out of time, which I can't believe. No, no, go on. Answer your question. I'd rather you keep going. I don't want to shorten this out because I think like this is the debates that we at the moment, you and I can have quite freely and quite publicly, but it's been lost by, wooden political speak, by
Yeah.
focus groups, etc. So please keep going with what you're about to say.
Well, you look at the way our society and workplaces and study places and everything is catapulting forward with AI. But
Mm.
the use of energy, water, electricity, and the rest of our data centers and other infrastructure that produces AI is huge.
Yeah,
So
it's
you've
massive.
got you're not just paying higher energy costs in the hip pocket at home, you're paying it in the cost of services and the cost of goods as well for those large energy users, those industrial sized energy users that produce the things that we all buy. So it's a broad cost of living issue. We're talking about housing, we're talking about transport infrastructure, we're talking about energy. These are three core areas that impact the Australian population in a time where incomes are not rising as fast as other costs, and there is a cost of living crisis as well as a housing crisis. But Australia is not alone in this, and Australia is better placed than many countries to be able to both weather and then find the opportunities out of these challenges because we've done it before. We need to remember that we're actually a very resilient country. We're a very stable country. We're a democratic country, and we've got a stable and strong economy overall. And we're good. We're innovative. We're really good at solving challenges like this. So with some bold leadership and some resilience from the community and strength of character, I truly think that Australians will go well and will do even better in the future than we're doing now.
I'm going to keep going then because that also you brought up there the issue around wages.
Mm.
What do we need to do to unlock that? Because again, the AI is part of this. It is supposedly making us more productive. What you've alluded to is what I've been saying too, which is that the AI cost, instead of it basically being in wages, it might actually come through higher energy and consumption. What do we need to do to actually unlock that wage potential that is there, but we are currently probably not using it to the best of our ability?
Well, it's all about productivity, and
Yeah.
productivity in the new digital age is completely different to whatever it was even 5 years ago. And, you look at the construction industry, for example, its productivity growth has been like 6% in 40 years. They just simply haven't been able to transition and change things. And this is some of the work I do with organizations is how do you get better at what we're doing? How do we employ technology to solve problems, get greater efficiency, help the workforce do their jobs better? And these are questions all organizations should be asking themselves in an effort to improve and increase productivity, which then allows people to do really good jobs even better and achieve more. And, it's that productivity of private enterprise and government as well that I believe then generates the argument for higher incomes because, revenues are higher and output is higher and the economy is stronger. But we're sort of still in that transition period between we know it's there, but we don't really know how to use it. We don't really know how to bring it in and employ it to drive revenues and assist our staff to do better. So once that really hits, this digital, age of incredible technology, then I think we will see economic growth that goes beyond what we're seeing now.
So, huge episode. Therefore, brings me to the one question I ask all of my guests. Danny Hunter, if you're in charge for just one day, what would you do?
Well, I'm an optimist, as you can probably tell, but
Yes, very much
I'm
so.
I'm also someone who's really committed to service and the service of others. I do a lot of work with the Salvation Army, and work within their sort of cafe that, gives food to people sort of sleeping rough and doing it rough. And that has given me more learnings about what's good and bad in our society and in our community than I could have ever learnt at university. So if I was in charge for a day, I'd give everyone the day off work to go and serve others, to go and learn in the real world, about how others are experiencing life, and hopefully be inspired enough to do something to change our community and our society for the better.
Beautiful answer. Danni Hunter, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was lovely. Thanks for talking to you.
Huge episode. And I'm glad I actually let Danni run, because I was going to wipe it up, but I'm glad I did not, because her thinking is just so incredible. And it is good to know that someone of Danni's quality is so close to decision making. And I really do hope that you got some really incredible insights out of what she's doing. She is absolutely at that forefront and is a thought leader and a leader as a whole for not just the Victorian community, but the community going large. Also, thank you to you guys out there for watching and listening. I really do appreciate it. Exchanges is becoming quite a brilliant community, and I'm loving that you're all part of it. Please remember, subscribe, whether you're listening or watching to this, wherever it is, on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, etc. Please subscribe, give it some form of like. We are continuing to really build here, and it's going great. Only 47% of those that actually interact are then looking at subscribing. So if you can, please click on that subscribe button. Don't forget also, have an email address to get us to exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. But until next week, thank you again for listening and watching. We are loving these going forward, and we'll see you next Wednesday.